Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The phone vibrated against the cheap laminate of the counter, the screen glowing with an unknown number that cut through the oppressive darkness of the studio apartment like a lifeline, or perhaps a noose. Julian didn't look at the caller ID. He was too busy pressing a cold compress to his bruised ribs, the souvenir of a debt collector's visit 3 hours prior. He swiped answer, expecting the landlord, expecting another threat, expecting the world to demand more blood from a stone. He didn't say hello. He just sighed, a sound of fractured, melodic exhaustion that carried the weight of 1,000 silent screams. Is it done? The voice on the other end was not the landlord. It was a baritone so deep it felt like a physical vibration against Julian's ear, cold as liquid nitrogen and sharp as a scalpel. It was the voice of a man standing over a grave. Julian froze, the ice pack dripping onto his bare thigh. I think you have the wrong number. Silence stretched across the line, heavy and static-charged. Then, in the background of the caller's end, a wet, gurgling sound erupted, a sound Julian recognized from horror movies, the sound of a throat opening up. A gunshot followed immediately, a dull thwack that wasn't loud, implying a silencer. Julian gasped, a sharp intake of breath that pitched high, terrified, and pure. "Don't hang up," the man on the other end commanded. The coldness was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying. Hunger. That sound. Make it again. Julian Vane lived a life painted in shades of gray and charcoal. Once, he had been a prodigy, a cellist with a scholarship to the conservatory and a future that glittered like gold dust. Then came the accident, the debt, the death of his parents, and the slow, grinding erosion of his soul. Now, he was a ghost haunting a city that had forgotten him, working graveyard shifts at a convenience store and dodging the shadowy figures his father had borrowed money from. He had hung up the phone that night. He had smashed the SIM card. He had hidden in his closet for 2 days. But you cannot hide from the wind, and you certainly cannot hide from the Draven Syndicate. It took them 3 days to find him. It wasn't a violent abduction, which made it worse. It was a sterile, efficient extraction. A black sedan idled by the curb as Julian walked home in the rain. 2 men in suits that cost more than Julian's lifetime earnings stepped out. They didn't draw weapons. They simply opened the door. "He is waiting," one of them said. Julian didn't ask who. The memory of that voice, the heavy, dark texture of it, was burned into his auditory cortex. He got in the car. They drove him to the spire, the glass monolith that pierced the smoggy skyline of the city's financial district. The elevator ride was a silent ascent into the heavens, the pressure building in Julian's ears. When the doors opened, he wasn't led to a dungeon, but to a penthouse that spanned the entire floor. It was a cathedral of modern minimalism, black marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling urban decay, and furniture that looked like sculptures. And there, sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair facing the window, was the monster. Cassius Draven. The name was whispered in back alleys and shouted in nightmares. The alpha of the city's underworld, a man who controlled the ports, the politicians, and the police. Cassius turned. He was terrifyingly beautiful, in the way a storm front is beautiful before it decimates a coastline. He had hair the color of obsidian, swept back from a face composed of sharp angles and pale skin. A jagged scar ran from his jaw down into the collar of his silk shirt, a permanent reminder of violence. But it was his eyes that froze Julian in place, steel gray, dilated, and rimmed with red exhaustion. "Speak," Cassius whispered. Julian stood by the elevator, his cheap sneakers squeaking on the marble. He was wet, shivering, and terrified. What do you want from me?" Cassius closed his eyes, his head tilting back against the leather. A shudder went through his massive frame, his hands unclenching from the armrests. "Again, please." Julian's voice trembled, possessing a natural, resonant timbre that he had always hated for being too soft, too lyrical. "I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. I just want to go home." Cassius stood up. He was tall, looming over 6 feet, radiating a heat and dominance that made the air in the room feel thin. He walked toward Julian, his movements predatory but controlled. He stopped inches away, smelling of expensive cognac, gunpowder, and rain. "You aren't going home, Julian," Cassius said, knowing his name. He reached out, his hand hovering near Julian's throat before his thumb brushed Julian's trembling lower lip. "For 5 years, I have not slept. The silence. It screams. The noise of this city. It bleeds into my skull. It is a condition, they say. Hyperacusis. Madness." Cassius leaned down, his lips brushing Julian's ear. "But then you answered the phone. Your voice. It is the first quiet thing I have heard in a decade. It is the eye of the storm. You want to keep me here?" "Because of my voice," Julian whispered, confusion warring with fear. "I want to own the silence," Cassius corrected. "And you, little bird, are the only silence I have found." The arrangement was perverse in its luxury. Julian was given a suite in the penthouse that was larger than his entire apartment building. He was fed meals prepared by a private chef. His debts were paid off in a single transaction that barely registered on the syndicate's books. The loan sharks who had broken his ribs were found floating in the harbor. In exchange, Julian had to exist. And he had to speak. Every night, when the city lights blurred into streaks of neon below, Julian would sit in the armchair opposite Cassius. Sometimes he read poetry, Keats, Shelley, Byron. Sometimes he read the stock reports. Sometimes, Cassius just wanted him to talk about his day, about the rain, about the way the cello felt against his chest. For the first month, Julian was a prisoner. He hated the golden cage. He hated the way Cassius looked at him, not with lust, initially, but with a terrifying, drug addict intensity. Julian was the fix. But as the weeks turned into months, the Stockholm Syndrome began to seep in, or perhaps it was simply the recognition of shared brokenness. Julian began to see the cracks in the Alpha's armor. He saw the way Cassius would wince when a glass was set down too hard. He saw the tremors in Cassius's hands when the migraines hit, blinding headaches that reduced the most dangerous man in the city to a groaning, curled-up figure on the floor. It was a Tuesday, 3 months in, when the dynamic shifted. Cassius was in the throes of an episode. He had torn apart the living room, overturning tables, shattering a priceless vase. His bodyguard stood outside the heavy oak doors, terrified to enter. Julian, driven by an instinct he couldn't name, walked into the storm. Cassius was on his knees amidst the wreckage, clutching his head, his breathing ragged. He looked up as Julian approached, his eyes wild, feral. "Get out," he roared. "Get out before I kill you." Julian didn't leave. He stepped over the broken porcelain. He knelt down in front of the man who held his life in his hands. He reached out and placed his hands over Cassius's ears, covering them, shielding him. "Look at me," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing hum. He began to hum a melody, a nocturne he used to play. Cassius froze. The roar in his head collided with the velvet texture of Julian's voice. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against Julian's chest. His hands, lethal weapons capable of snapping necks, gripped the fabric of Julian's sweater, desperate and clinging. "Make it stop," Cassius rasped, sounding like a child lost in the dark. "I'm here," Julian whispered, stroking the coarse, dark hair. "Just listen to me. Focus on the vibration. Focus on my heartbeat." They stayed like that for hours. And for the first time, Julian realized that the monster wasn't keeping the bird in a cage to sing. The monster was the one in the cage, and the bird was the only one with the key. The intimacy of the voice led to the intimacy of the flesh. It was a slow burn, an agonizing drift toward the inevitable. It started with lingering touches, Cassius's hand on the small of Julian's back as they looked out at the city. It progressed to Cassius sleeping in the same room, just to hear Julian's breathing. Then came the night of the gala. The syndicate was hosting a charity event, a front for laundering money and cementing alliances. Cassius insisted Julian attend. "You are my piece," he had said, fastening a diamond cufflink onto Julian's wrist. "I need you close." Julian wore a suit of midnight blue velvet, tailored to accentuate the slender lines of his body. He felt exposed, surrounded by sharks in expensive suits. He stuck to Cassius's side like a shadow. But the world of the Mafia does not respect peace. Rival families were present. The tension was a taut wire ready to snap. A man from the Rossi family, a brute with a thick neck and cruel eyes, cornered Julian near the bar while Cassius was distracted by a senator. So this is the pet, the Rossi man sneered, grabbing Julian's arm. Pretty thing. Does he let you talk? Or are you just for looking? Julian tried to pull away. Let go. Feisty. The man laughed, tightening his grip. Maybe I'll take you for a test drive. Cassius doesn't share toys, but... The man didn't finish the sentence. Cassius materialized. There was no other word for it. One moment he was across the room, the next he was there. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply took a champagne flute from a passing waiter, shattered it against the bar counter, and drove the jagged stem through the Rossi man's hand, pinning it to the mahogany. The room went silent. The scream that followed was curdling. Cassius leaned in, his face devoid of emotion, his voice a low rumble that only Julian and the victim could hear. Touch him again, and I will carve your family tree out of your flesh. He grabbed Julian's hand, his grip bruising, and dragged him out of the ballroom, through the kitchen, and into the waiting elevator. The ride up was suffocating. Cassius was vibrating with rage, the adrenaline spiking his sensitivity. He was pacing the small box like a caged tiger. When the doors opened to the penthouse, Cassius didn't stop. He marched Julian into the bedroom and slammed the door. You are mine, Cassius growled, pinning Julian against the heavy wood. Do you understand? They look at you, and I want to burn the city down. They touch you, and I want to bathe in their blood. Cassius, stop, Julian gasped, his hands resting on Cassius's chest, feeling the erratic, thundering heart. You're hurting me. Cassius froze. The red haze in his eyes cleared slightly at the sound of Julian's distress. He pulled back, horrified at his own strength. I didn't. It's okay, Julian whispered. He reached up, cupping Cassius's jaw, his thumb tracing the scar. I'm okay. I'm yours, Cassius. I've been yours since I answered the phone. The confession broke the dam. Cassius kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate claiming. It tasted of violence and salvation. Cassius lifted Julian, wrapping his legs around his waist, and carried him to the bed. That night, there were no words. There was only the language of bodies, the friction of skin, the desperate need to merge two broken halves into a whole. Julian found that he didn't mind the darkness in Cassius. He found that his own light shone brighter within it. And Cassius found that the silence he craved wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of love. But happiness in the underworld is a beacon for tragedy. The Rossi family did not take the insult lightly. War was declared. The streets turned red. Cassius was gone for days at a time, returning with blood on his cuffs and eyes deadened by slaughter. Julian became the anchor, the reason Cassius came back from the abyss each time. Then came the betrayal. It wasn't a rival who struck the blow. It was the head of security, a man Cassius had trusted for 20 years. A sum of money, a promise of power, and the penthouse codes were sold. Julian was reading in the library when the power cut. The emergency lights bathed the room in a crimson glow. He heard the elevator chime. He knew it wasn't Cassius. He ran. He made it to the panic room, a reinforced steel box hidden behind a bookcase. He punched in the code. The door hissed shut just as the gunfire erupted, bullets sparking against the closing metal. Inside, Julian huddled in the corner. The room was soundproof, equipped with oxygen and rations. But there was no signal. The landline had been cut. There was only the red phone, an ancient, hardwired line that connected directly to Cassius's private frequency, bypassing the cellular networks. Julian picked up the receiver. His hands shook so hard he almost dropped it. Talk to me. Cassius's voice answered instantly. He sounded breathless, surrounded by noise, sirens, shouting. Cassius, Julian sobbed. They're here. In the penthouse. The code. Someone gave them the code. Are you in the vault? Cassius's voice was pure panic. Yes, but they're drilling. I can hear it. Cassius, I'm scared. Listen to me, Julian. Cassius commanded, and Julian could hear the sound of a car engine revving to its limit. I am 3 minutes away. I am coming for you. Do not open that door. Do not stop talking to me. What if they get in? They won't. I will kill them all. Every single one of them. Cassius. Julian closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. If I don't make it. Stop. Cassius roared. Do not say it. Sing, Julian. Sing for me. Guide me home. And so, in the dark, With the sound of a diamond-tipped drill grinding against the steel door, Julian sang. He sang the aria he had auditioned with for the conservatory. He sang through the tears, his voice gaining strength, filling the small space. On the other end of the line, Cassius Draven drove his armored Maybach through the lobby of his own building, shattering the glass doors. He emerged from the wreckage with dual pistols, a demon unleashed. He fought his way up the stairs, 30 floors, because the elevators were locked down. He moved with a speed that defied human limits, driven by the voice in his ear. The drilling stopped. The door to the vault groaned. "They're through," Julian whispered. "Cassius, I'm here." A massive explosion rocked the penthouse. Cassius had breached the wall from the adjacent stairwell using C4. Julian heard the gunfire. Loud, close, deafening. Then, silence. The vault door was pried open. Light flooded in. Cassius stood there, covered in dust and blood, none of it his own. He dropped his weapons and fell to his knees, pulling Julian into his arms. He buried his face in Julian's neck, inhaling deeply, shaking uncontrollably. "You're safe," Cassius choked out. "You're safe." Julian held him, rocking him back and forth. "I know. I knew you'd come." The aftermath was a cleansing fire. The traitor was executed publicly. The Rossi family was dismantled, their assets seized. Cassius Draven cemented his rule with an iron fist, but the city noticed a change in him. The unpredictable rage was gone. The chaotic violence was replaced by cold, calculated order. 6 months later, Julian stood on the balcony of a new home, a villa on the coast, far away from the smog and the noise. The wind smelled of salt and jasmine. Cassius stepped up behind him, wrapping his arms around Julian's waist. He rested his chin on Julian's shoulder. The nightmares still came sometimes, but now, Cassius had a way to wake up. "It's quiet here," Cassius murmured. "Is it too quiet?" Julian asked, leaning back into the warmth of the alpha. "No." Cassius pressed a kiss to the side of his neck. "Because I can hear you breathing. That is all the sound I need." Julian smiled. He thought back to that night in his dingy apartment, the wrong number that had changed the trajectory of the stars. It wasn't a wrong number, he realized now. It was the universe correcting a mistake. "Cassius. I love you." Cassius turned Julian around, his gray eyes clear and filled with a devotion that bordered on worship. "And I," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through Julian's chest, "am listening." And that is how the viper tamed the wolf. If you enjoyed seeing Julian become the calm to Cassius's storm, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive a husband whose first gift to you was a golden cage? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then,